Well, hello there, and thank you very much for tuning in. A warm welcome to you all. My name is Donald Sloan, and I am chair of the Oxford Cultural Collective. I am in London, and I'm joined from her home in Brooklyn, New York City, by my friend and colleague, Dr. Jessica Harris. Now, this conversation that we're going to have forms part of a series that we are staging, which we're calling Eating, Drinking, Thinking. And it's me in conversation with the patrons of the Oxford Cultural Collective, of which Jessica is one. And the patrons, of course, are all distinguished in their various fields. They are our international ambassadors. And in these various discussions, we'll be exploring aspects of their professional contributions, but also getting their perspectives on a range of different issues. So, real privilege today to be joined by Dr. Jessica Harris. For those of you who don't know Jessica so well, let me just tell you a bit about her. She is Emeritus Professor of English at Queen's College, City University of New York. She is a preeminent scholar on the food of the African Diaspora. She has written 12 cookbooks, as well as her book High on the Hog, A Culinary Journey from Africa to America, her memoir, My Soul Looks Back, and just last week, her newest book, Vintage Postcards from the African World, in the Dignity of Their Work and the Joy of Their Play. And we're going to be talking about vintage postcards in this conversation. As you can imagine, Jessica has many, many accolades to her name. Most recently, she was the recipient of the 2020 James Beard Foundation Lifetime Achievement Award. Welcome, Jessica. How are you doing?
I think I'm okay. I'm not sure. There's so much going on in our world right now that it's, my head is spinning like a top.
Yeah, exactly. But we'll try to keep it positive. We'll try to not,
absolutely
not dwell on the many negatives. But it's great to see you. I thought it would be good to start this conversation, Jessica, talking a bit about your memoir, because it reveals so much about you, and it's a great sort of contextual way to start our discussion. I've got a copy here for those.
Sort of like before and after. That's never good.
A fabulous photo of you on the front, which I just love. But the book, the memoir, it deals with, you could say, your formative years, both your childhood with your very influential, positive influence from your parents, but also this, your entry, if you like, into this group of intellectuals in New York City in the 1970s, that included a number of notable figures, including Maya Angelou and James Baldwin. The book also deals with your relationship with Sam Floyd, and I won't talk too much about that because for those who haven't read it, they really should. It's written in your very distinctive lyrical style, which really draws the reader in. But I'm wondering, it's actually a very brave thing to do, to write a memoir, to reveal so much to those you don't know. I mean, what was your motivation for writing My Soul Looks Back?
Oh, goodness. I am not really sure, but I know that the catalyst was certainly Maya Angelou's death.
Yeah.
And I, very vividly recall that moment. I was in New Orleans, I was asleep, and there's a time difference between the East Coast and New Orleans. It's 1 hour, but I was called by a friend who is a much earlier riser than I am, let me just say that. And it was even earlier because it was in New Orleans, who sort of rather brutally said, "Oh my God, Maya's," well, it's like,
yeah.
And then I was up and then things were crazy and the phone started ringing. Another friend of mine who writes at the New York Times knew Maya, and so asked me if I would write a piece about cooking with Maya, and I did. And then that piece kind of became the genesis for the book. My publisher at that point was like, "Oh no, we want to do, we think that this is the grist for a book. And then the book ended up being, more than just the story of Maya. And I actually knew Maya. My calling her Maya tells anyone who knows her well how long I knew her, because I knew her from when she was Maya. And eventually she sort of morphed into Dr. Angelou. And I kind of good with that as third person address. Let me pause for a second, Don. There's a train that goes by. So I don't know if you're editing this or not. Not? All right.
That's okay, go on. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll go on, and you listeners forgive my train. It's the Long Island Railroad in Brooklyn, New York. But anyhow, the point was that that I knew Maya for more than 40 years.
Yeah.
And so she certainly watched me grow up from basically pretty much fresh out of graduate school, all the way through the publication of certainly probably my first 6 or more books, and, becoming whoever this strange culinary person is that I am on some occasions. So that is a very long answer to a very short question.
And did you achieve what you set out to achieve with the book? I mean, how did you feel differently about your life after having gone through that process than when you started out?
I think really almost unbeknownst to me, it was something I needed to do. I needed to get that out. I think it was sort of stuck somewhere, and the getting out of it made it, if not better, at least easier. It was it was a bit of a weight, and I have and had and have an extraordinary editor. I had the same editor for High on the Hog and for My Soul Looks Back, and those are two really sort of disparately, wildly different books. But she knew me from High on the Hog. I cried a lot writing My Soul Looks Back because it involved a lot of her going, "No, Jessica, I think you've got more to say than that. No, Jessica, don't be so mean-spirited. No, Jessica, you need to tell the entire story. No, Jessica." So tears were involved.
And she was hanging over your shoulder as a guiding influence throughout the process.
Well, she was, sort of whispering into my ear quietly through the entire process. And so she's now stuck with me. We're bonded. We're joined at the hip. In fact, during this sequester period in New York, she is now my sainted editor, because she is shopping for me once a week, and she and her husband bring me my groceries. So we have morphed so far beyond editor and writer to a very real, tangible, and extraordinary friendship.
Well, the book, as I say, maps your entry into this amazing and ultimately very influential set, including Maya and Baldwin and others. But it also tracks the development of your professional career as a writer. It's interesting that you started out as, one might say, a mainstream journalist before tracking towards the world of food. What was it that started to take you in the direction of the culinary rather than, shall we say, the mainstream?
Well, I was what they call actually a back of the book editor. A back of the book writer, the back of the book being, the travel, the food, the music, the reviews, the so on and so forth. I started out actually doing book reviews, and I started out doing book reviews and theater reviews. I've been told I am the first Black woman to vote for the Tony Awards. So I was a theater critic, if you will, and I always made a distinction between being a reviewer and being a critic. I like to think I was a critic simply because my training and background are actually in French and in theater. My doctorate is in theater. But so I did those. I then sort of morphed into travel. I've always been a traveler. I grew up, because of the elementary school I went to, going to being raised in an international world. I went to the United Nations International School, and so one of my oldest friends is a Shivite Brahmin from Madras, India. So I've always had a kind of cultural fluidity that was the result of that. And I always wanted to, and eventually when I was able to, did travel. So the travel is what took me into food. I became the travel editor of Essence in the late 1970s, and then moved from that into travel and food. I sometimes jokingly tell people I was writing about food and travel and culture probably before Anthony Bourdain was born, and certainly before he was out of high school. So I've been doing it for a long time. And then that ultimately took me into food. But the academic part of it then took me into the food history kind of thing and the food and anthropology. My first cookbook was called Hot Stuff, and it was about food made with peppers and chilies from around the world. And I found myself reading, you know, Columbus's diaries and Marco Polo's diaries. And so the research orientation of the academic side of the brain then worked in conjunction with the culinary side and the travel side. So.
And of course, as a culinary historian, you've really made your mark on telling, I guess, what you could call the hidden stories of the influence of the food of African nations on the tastes and lifestyles of contemporary America, shall we say. How have you seen things change in that respect over the period during which you have been writing on that subject?
Well, I think that there's a twofold answer. One is, how have I seen them change? And the other is, well, or have they changed?
Oh, exactly, yeah.
And I think that to some extent they have changed a bit, but I think equally there is an awful lot of, you know, ground to still be covered. I think one of the biggest changes is there are, thank the Lord, more people in the room. I mean, there is now a growing number of African Americans who are journalists, who are cookbook authors, who are chefs of their own restaurants of every size and stripe, who are tastemakers, who are producers of food, who are all of those things, who are becoming increasingly known.
Yeah.
And that's an extraordinary thing and a very good thing. And there's still so much more to be done in that arena. The person who wrote the book, and I'm going to be horribly forgetful because I'm suffering from what I call pandemic brain, but Acid, Salt.
Yes, Persian.
That book,
Yeah.
Samin, just yesterday listed and posted on her Instagram page, where she has more than 500,000 followers, about 36 or 40 pictures and I think profiles, I'm not even sure, of African Americans in the culinary world at this particular moment.
I saw it.
Say, follow them, you know.
Yeah.
And what people have been doing is just that, following people, so that people have awakened, or people are slowly being, I can't say educated, but they're being informed. They are, some of them, you know, I mean, it doesn't take very much to click on an Instagram thing and say follow. The question may very well be, what does that mean? How does that work? But people are becoming more and more aware that things need to open, need to change, need to evolve. And it is not just time, it is way past time.
I'm interested, something you said before about where your interest in research came from and where the academic side of your career developed from. I mean, have you seen yourself primarily as a researcher, as an academic, or do you see yourself as somebody who's leading a quest to change attitudes? Are you, in a sense, part of a movement to try to get, I mean, for example, there's a line I was struck by in High on the Hog when I was looking at it again recently. And of that quest, you say, it's a simple request to be acknowledged for the integral part that we have played in the formation of American culinary ethos, to sit down at the table of success with members of the food community and to begin to truly eat and live high on the hog. And that sounds to me like it's about a purpose, it's about taking us somewhere.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that happened is, in some cases, the purpose found me. Remember, this is a journey that I began at this point over 40 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, and at that point, no, I don't know that I knew what I was doing. I was, you know, wallowing about, having, you know, traveling and eating and having my mouth say, ooh, this is like that. And not realizing that I was, in fact, making those connections in particular ways. So it was not necessarily a stated intent at the beginning, but I think it has become very much an intent at this moment and at this time, toward, well, hopefully not toward the end, but in the ending zone, let's put it that way.
Okay, let's turn our attention to your latest book, the Vintage Postcards from the African World. We actually have some images. No point in talking about a book that is full of wonderful images if we're not going to share some of those images. So assuming my skills, there we are. There is the cover. But this, Jessica, is it's a glorious collection of postcards, images of, and commentary on images from African nations, but also from the Caribbean, and those depicting African Americans in America. And it's interesting that you talk, first of all, in the book about you as a collector, and you're not exclusively a collector of postcards, you're a collector of many things. Indeed, you say, if it collects dust, then I collect it.
That's pretty much the way it goes.
But
anyone who's been to my house knows that.
A collection of postcards. What is it about postcards in particular that captured you all this time ago and led you to developing this very substantial collection?
Well, I think there are a lot of things. I think one thing is they're small, they're portable. As you travel, as I travel, I'm usually, you know, laden like a pack mule with the 8 million other things I've got. Postcards would always be able to slip in somewhere and fit somewhere. The other thing is they are astounding because of what they tell you and how deeply you look and how deeply one has to look. Even with the, you know, cover image, the lady with her extraordinary direct gaze, her hand on the bananas, the other hand on her hip, a real kind of almost studied pose. And it is in fact a pose because, although I didn't necessarily know this at first glance with the postcard, but if you look behind her, that's a painted backdrop. So this is a studio portrait of some kind.
Right, yes. Yeah.
So, you know, there's so many layers to each card. I think as you go into them, you see them. You may not know a story. Sometimes you invent a story. Sometimes the story is, well, considerably less frequently, the story is told, or some parts of the story are told to you. And certainly in dealing with cards from the African world, one of the things that certainly happens is that these cards were photographed by people who were not from the African world. So you have another layer of other people's thoughts and ideas and comfort levels and, you know, fantasies and phantasms put on top of the people who are actually being photographed, who may or may not be complicit or be totally oblivious to all of those other layers. And I think the first card we're going to see shows that.
It does. We'll move on to just one other question about that process, though, because something in the introduction that on reflection is blindingly obvious, but I hadn't thought about it before, is that, you know, postcards are made to be sent home. So the primary points of collection for you were in the cities of colonial nations. You collected in London, you collected in Paris, primarily, and also in Brussels. But where did you actually find the cards? What about that process of collection?
Oh goodness, well, there's an essay on it in the book, but a variety of things. Certainly, initially, antique stores, flea markets.
Yeah.
Then probably as my knowledge base widened, antiquarian bookshops often, because sometimes they're tucked into old books, sometimes they're an album of postcards. Postcard collecting was a major hobby at the turn of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And so people kept albums and albums of them. And, folks would send a postcard home to so-and-so for the collection or what have you. So those turn up in antiquarian bookshops. Then there are actually postcard fairs. There are specialist magazines for postcard collectors. There are very, very specialized postcard collectors who only collect postcards of their particular village in, such and such a time, or who only collect such and such a train system and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So there are also specialist vendors. And eventually I made my way to auctions and specialist vendors. So you can find them pretty much anywhere. I do have to offer a caveat though, which is a lot of the ones of the kind that I initially got, I can no longer find. They've gotten more and more rare as folks have, come more and more into understanding basically Black memorabilia.
Yeah.
Things that had to do with the experience of Africans in diaspora. And so that, while there's some good ones still out there, they've gone up and they're no longer the just I'll buy 5. There may be the, ooh, I think I can buy 1.
Yes, okay, it's become a serious business here. Let's take a look at some of the cards then. I mean, you had started to talk there about the interpretation of them and the fact that historical research might help in some cases, but there's an air of mystery around many of them. And you categorize the cards, right? You categorize the cards into those that are of African nations, those that are from the Caribbean, and those that are depicting images from America. But also you categorize them by activity, if you like, or by function. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, this is one that didn't end up being categorized quite that way because it is one of the last postcards I purchased.
Yeah.
At the time at which I purchased this card, I already knew I was writing the book.
Okay.
This is an extraordinary card. You see it, there is a woman sort of standing slightly off center. It says M. Barnett at the top. And then at the bottom of the card, almost stripped in, I can't read it. Perhaps you can read it more clearly.
Yeah, as you say, at first a fairly innocuous picture and then shocking when you read what's at the base. But yes, it says the old slave block in the old St. Louis Hotel, New Orleans. The colored woman standing on the block was sold for $1,500 on this same block when a little girl.
Right. So that right there contextualizes it completely differently from what one might see if that had not been there.
Yeah.
So that gives us more of a text than we usually get. But we still don't know what is that woman feeling. How did she end up on that block again? Who put her there to photograph her? Was there a purpose of that photograph? And some of them were to raise money for abolitionist cause. Well, I think this is post-enslavement because this is a more recent card than that. But for varying causes to raise funds. Is that why she's there? How does she feel about being back? There's so many questions that come with that and with that image, particularly now because we know a little bit more about it. We don't always know as much. And, you know, some of the cards we'll see subsequently, you can see how little we actually know.
Yeah. And that probably applies to the next one that we can take a look at, which really draws you in. But what do you know about this card?
Not a thing. Not a thing. This is another recent card. That little boy's face is just so amazing. Yeah. I don't know whether to smile or cry every time I look at this, because the caption, Southern Dinner Toter Macon, Georgia. Is this little boy working? Is he bringing dinner to a relative who's working, or is he in fact working at a job? There is something somewhere on the basket that gives the name of somebody, so it looks as though,
yeah, Mr. F. Patton.
Yeah, I'm not even sure what that means. I don't know if he's trying, you know, if he's carrying dinner to people under the auspices of Mr. F. Patton. But his face, that the solemnity of this obviously posed studio portrait, is amazing. You wonder who his parents were. Wonder who he grew up to be. You wonder, did he grow up? How he grew up? All of those questions are right there. And you look in his eyes and wonder, what did he see as he looked out at the photographer? And you get all of that in that one little click of the snapshot.
Yeah, yeah. It's certainly immensely powerful, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Many of the images of taken in African nations, many of them in West African nations, of course, depict aspects of colonial rule. Now, this is another striking photograph of children, young boys returning from work. What are your observations on this card, Jessica?
Well, this card was interesting because there was a whole set, or a whole, I guess, grouping of cards that were done by missions, mission work. And so the missions published cards that were then sold to raise money for the missions. And this is one of those cards. And obviously the gentleman in front, and the card is photographed in such a way that we can't tell, but I would suspect he is possibly a priest or an acolyte of some sort who is in charge of this group of young boys who are returning from some kind of agricultural labor, because each one is carrying a hoe.
Yep.
And so they have, come back from their duties. I don't know if it's an orphanage and the young men are working as part of that, if it's a school. There's no other indication of what it might be. And if you look, the young men range in age. The one that's in the lower right-hand corner is very young compared to some of the boys that are in the back. As the line progresses toward the left. So we really don't know. We don't know. We do know that it was a card that was used in fundraising of some sort, but beyond that, no idea.
No. Moving to images of the Caribbean, coaling in St. Lucia. I mean, this is the image is clear in its intent and clear in its purpose. But what would you say about this particular image?
Well, I think one of the things we forget is just how involved with all aspects of life people of African descent were, not only in the United States, but on the African continent itself, and certainly in hemispheric generality in the so-called New World. And so what we're looking at here are people carrying baskets of coal hence coaling, onto a ship that was powered, obviously, by a coal boiler. And so they've got baskets. This set of folks is actually male and female. There are men and women in this one.
Mm-hmm.
In another one, there is a portrait of a woman by herself who was one of those coaling women. And one of the things that's interesting is that that one gives some more specifics in the notes that were taken by the person who was sending the card.
Mm.
And that one says that they were given 1 sou, a paltry sum of money, I don't know what the 2020 equivalent would be, for every 2 baskets. And that the baskets weighed 46 kilos each.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
So we're talking 90, almost 100 pounds.
Yeah, yeah.
1 sou for about 100 pounds
Mm-hmm.
carried. And that they did about 200 baskets a day.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you begin to think about what that meant in terms of labor for little money,
It tells a powerful story.
it tells you something about the complete, total, and utter exploitation.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned there also about the notes on the card. I mean, how much, when you're thinking about context and doing some informal interpretation, how much do you get from the messages that are written on the cards, you know, from being sent from person A to person B?
Well, it all depends, because postcards, you know, we live so much in our era of smartphones,
Mm-hmm.
where we're taking pictures and we're text messaging and we're, you know, doing all of that, that we don't realize that even as recently as the turn of the 20th century, which is, yes, 120 years ago, but that's relatively recent in human time, people weren't able to do that. So postcards were an innovation because they could send little messages, brief messages. And so the back of this card could say, and I don't remember what it says, but it could conceivably say, meet me at the station at 5:15.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
You know, it doesn't necessarily have any correlation to what's on the front of the card.
Yeah.
It's only occasionally that people actually comment on the card. And that's when it becomes particularly rich in depth.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned before about the issue of the notion that some of the cards contain posed images, you know, and something you mentioned in the introduction to the book also that's interesting is this notion that the cards can play a role in shaping and reinforcing, if you like, perceptions or stereotypical perceptions of those of African origin. I mean, what role do the cards play in that respect of sort of shaping, in quite a malign way, shaping the perceptions of people, individuals, groups of people?
Well, I mean, I think they can. You know, we are at that point imputing intent to the photographer.
Yeah.
And not always. So sometimes it was just an interesting scene.
Yeah.
That they thought. The French have a category of postcards that they call scènes et types, scenes and types. So they were scenes, typical scenes and typical people, whatever that means. This one is a set of a series that were done in Martinique and Guadeloupe by, I think it's Édition Fausse. And what is interesting about them is that they very much are about the street vendors.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of people that you might see on the street. They're also very clearly posed, very clearly studio shots. And they offer, again, a lens into all sorts of things. One of the things that I find fascinating about all of the cards is how costume is shown. I mean, if you look at this woman, she has what in Martinique and Guadeloupe is called a grande robe. So she's dressed in a certain way. She has her head tie. All of those things are indicators of class, of stature in the society, of things of that sort, that the photographer may not have known.
Mm-hmm.
but that bring another level and layer to it. The young man, I guess, who is purchasing has on a hat. You know, that's kind of an unusual hat. It's not a straw hat. It's more of a European type newsboy's cap.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you see him getting the coconuts. What she's doing is something that's pretty timeless in the Caribbean, which is she's got the coconuts and she is cutting a hole in it so that he can drink the coconut water. And so while, yes, it is slightly stereotypical, it is, I think, this one probably relatively benignly so.
Mm-hmm.
There are some, particularly the United Statesian ones in the American context, that are very, very negative. And in fact, I don't collect those.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. And this, I guess, a street vendor again with just about the biggest oysters I think I've ever seen.
Well, exactly. And I mean, that's another thing that the card does. The card can show you what was at one point relatively commonplace. Oysters used to be this size.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And now they are no longer. But the other thing that if you look at is slightly malign is they're both the young man selling the oysters and the oysters, excuse me, referred to as Norfolk natives from Norfolk, Virginia. So exactly placing the young man in the same category as the oyster.
Yeah, it sits very uncomfortably, doesn't it, that title? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not, it's like, you're missing a point here. Mm-hmm. Or perhaps making a point that I don't want to acknowledge as a point. But I think that all of that is a part of what also happens sometimes with the cards. Subtly, if you look at the captions or the printed captions, what's being said and what's being intimated, what's being suggested. And the suggestion is, of course, that the young man is of equal value to the oyster.
Mm-hmm. And
that's clearly not the case. He's obviously in service in some ways. He may be an oyster shucker, mm-hmm. you know, because a lot of African American men, particularly in Virginia, the eastern shore of Virginia and the eastern shore of Maryland, had a history of Black oystermen. And those Black oystermen were legendary, okay, legendary to the point that one of them, named Thomas Downings, actually had an oyster refectory in New York City, mm-hmm. where I think he served Charles Dickens. He equally sent oysters to Queen Victoria. Mm-hmm. He became quite the purveyor of oysters. People clamored to get to Downing's oyster refectory. So this last one also is a kind of nod of the head or a tip of the talk to that as well.
Well, it's fascinating, Jessica, we unfortunately only looking at a few images, and there are many, many, many in this collection, of course, but it is incredible that a curated collection of postcards can reveal so much and do it so powerfully, and in some cases so hauntingly. So congratulations on the book, and obviously it's available now. One final thing, you've got that book out of the way. What's next on the agenda?
Getting out of quarantine.
Yeah.
But after that, I'm working on a book that's going to look at the kind of what I call the braid of American culinary culture, the bedrock heritage between the Africans, the native people, and the African Americans. The Europeans, the Africans who would become African Americans, and the native peoples. And so I'm going to look at them and some of their dishes and how they morphed to become kind of a bedrock across the board of American food. Mm-hmm. And looking at that.
Well, we'll look forward to that. But for now, Jessica Harris, thank you very, very much indeed. And hopefully we'll be out of lockdown soon and we can get together face-to-face rather than via Zoom.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.